think so. I think so.
One of us will try and be here at any given time in case you guys need anything.
Okay.
You know, run it, so to speak.
I think we should be okay. We're just going to go through this and speak as we go through it. Explain what the committee has done, what the committee position is.
I'm sorry, sir. They're not silent yet.
See, if we only have this many people present, there's no need for me to be up there at the podium. Although I could to control it. We did get that. Yeah. Well, it's going to be up there. We're doing it the other end. It's going to be one of the last things so it imprints. Yeah. That was, and it only came about as a result. It only came about as a result of we had a discussion, myself and Terry, and I was with the speaker at the time. I said, I'm really pissed off at Anna. It's the way she's been providing positions going the other way.
She did that back in February, March last year.
She did that on the support bill.
Right.
And so then Terry said, I can't believe Anna would do something. Well, I said, she's mentioned it the other day to
He's going to say,
You can hear us?
Can you hear me? I don't know whether I should go up there. Depends on the number of people. Yeah. Well, there are presenters that are going to be presenting down here, and some so there's going to be 4 of us. 1, 2, 3. I need a 4th one. I need to be up here. Well, I could be right here.
Drew's going to take off because he's working on another report that they want to get out today.
Okay, because I had.
see it.
I had a sheet to help with yeah. Okay, so I'm
eligible and qualifying uses, that's you, right?
Right. I'll sit with you. Why not?
Accountability, we both can, you can chime in. Myths and reality, that would be Drew.
Yeah, he's mainly going to, he's going to touch on private school and then fiscal. Yeah.
Okay, and constitutional is Tim.
Tim.
And we can just tell stories. There were 3 kids in Haver that left 2 years ago. Having a hard time in middle school. Very successful. Went to another school for a while.
Here's a hard copy of our slide presentation.
Okay, I think where I'm going to do, because if I stand right here, I got my back to the screen.
Okay,
So I'm going to be up there.
okay. Do you want me to do, I can do the,
Yeah.
yeah.
I was just wondering because somebody's going to have to look before. And I could do that because I designed that. So I could just hit the button right here. Yeah, I think it'll be a lot easier. Obviously. Yeah. And then we're going to have those. Yes, that would be a lot easier. I think we're going to. Yes. Yeah. Well, no. There's one attorney, and
People handing them out.
we have most of these on the floor itself. How are you? These are professionals that have nothing to do. I know Walter.
Okay, so you're all set.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, where's Drew and I need Glenn and Drew and Tim. I need Tim Giller, Drew Klein, and Glenn Cordelli. Okay, I think we're at the point where we should start this information session. What I need to do, though, is have some of the presenters sit down at the table in front of me. So Representative Cordelli and Tim Keller and Drew Klein. Drew, where are you? Coming through the door. Okay, before we go, pardon me? Yes, I have a few things which before we get into this, we got to communicate to everybody present. This is an information session for those that are in the legislature to hear about the committee position on SB 193. This is a bill that deals with education savings accounts. And so we have those people sitting before you right now. We have Tim Keller to your right, Tim Keller comes from the Institute for Justice. And then we have Representative Glenn Cordelli, who's on the Education Committee. And Drew Klein is supposed to be sitting over there. Drew is also chair of the State Board of Education and also has done the financial report that we have received from the Josiah Bartlett Center. For those in the balcony up top, we welcome you, but this is a session for just those people sitting here, which are legislators, to ask questions and to be more informed about this particular bill. And remind all that we do have a proper decorum here in the House, and all should try to follow that, please. We have also some handouts, and everybody should have, we have a PowerPoint we're going to go through. You should have this sheet right here. This is shrunk down so you can't see it. Hopefully you can see what's behind me here. So this is the PowerPoint. There's also another sheet which Representative Cordelli is holding up right now, and everybody should have those to follow along. Okay, I'm going to go ahead. Yes, Representative Petrie. Oh, you don't have a copy? The PowerPoint is also up here. There's lots of them. No. No, I haven't looked at that. Okay, let me go ahead and start on this.
Hi, Joe.
Okay, we'd like to go ahead. The purpose of this presentation, of course, is to inform you about SB 193, and we are going to walk through various elements within that bill so you can better understand some of the specifics within the bill. We're going to do a brief overview of what an education plan is, savings account is, and do that overview, brief introduction. Then we're going to get into the eligibility, who is eligible to participate in this program, the accountability aspects of it, the accountability in terms of the parent, the receiving school possibly, the homeschooler, all that will be in the accountability section. Then we're going to get into a section which is dealing with financial impacts, how this may impact your school district, your community, your town. And then we get into the constitutionality of this particular bill. And then the panel right here will present you some stories or experiences in which have been encountered in the state with children that have been in the education credit scholarship program. I also want to let you know that this morning I woke up and it was cold, 27 degrees outside, but my heart also decided to go into AFib. So I'm standing here before you today trying to battle that one as well as trying to present something logically and so that you can understand it. I'll do my best. As you can see, the purpose of an ESA is to provide children and parents more options that best fit their particular individual needs. I was reading a book just last night on Winston Churchill, and he always started all his briefings out with a question. So perhaps we should start out with a question too. Can there be anything more important to the future of New Hampshire than providing the best possible education for all its children? And that's what we got to remind ourselves as we go through this right now. It's for the benefit of children. And as I mentioned to you, this is going to be our process for today. As we complete each of those elements, we will open it up to questions. So you don't have to hold your questions to the very end. If you have a question about eligibility, if you have a question about accountability, if you have a question about fiscal, or if you have a question about the constitutionality, When we close that particular presentation, we'll open it up for some questions, although we don't want the questions to drag on so we don't get to the whole presentation today. I'm trying to get used to this PC machine. I'm an Apple fan, and that's a little bit different. An ESA is like a scholarship program. There is a difference between what we've seen in the education tax credit program, where this money's coming from the state and go directly to that school, or for possibly some other function. These monies in this program pass directly to the parent, and then the parent uses those to seek out a program of instruction and curriculum that best fits their particular child. There is a difference. And so the Education Savings Account program is not a voucher program. We've had in the Education Committee this past year, and we've been working on this bill for some time. It is a retained bill. And we've had many people testify, and we've heard from parents, we've heard from administrators, from teachers, from school board members throughout the state of New Hampshire. And some of the parents are saying, and one in particular has said exactly what's up behind me on the screen, that my child is young, my child's in only 4th grade just once in their life, maybe twice if they've retained, but once hopefully, and they only 9 years old or 10 years old once. They only have one chance, one time in order to acquire what they need to be on a pathway to an education which is really going to support their needs later on in life. So parents are saying, we need something now if, in fact, my child doesn't fit into the mold or into the situation that may be in my school, in my hometown. There are a number of reasons why parents decide and students need to be placed in another option. I've experienced that in my own family, where I had a young granddaughter who was bullied. And even though the school acted very appropriately and did step in and address the issue, the bullying continued. And it was an emotional drain on that child, on my granddaughter, and it was impacting her progress and moving forward, and this was while she was in the upper levels of middle school. Since then, Grandpa, right here, had to step in, and Grandpa was fortunate to have some dollars to help her, and we tuitioned her to another school. In the school district I'm in, there's only one option. That's the local school. In the school district just south of me, that school district has many options. They can send their kids in the high school level, because they tuition their students out, their K through 8, to Rivendell, to Oxbow, which is across in Vermont, down to Thetford Academy. They used to send to Mascoma until it got too expensive, to Woodsville High School, and St. Johnsbury Academy. So they have that option. I didn't have that. And so I did send her on to St. J Academy, where she has just blossomed, and a senior right now, come out of her shell, and was the Athlete of the Year in the state of Vermont for the last 2 years, and just received last week a full ride scholarship to the University of Maine at $40,000 a year for both academics and athletics. That wouldn't have happened in the community that we were in, because they didn't have the programming that she's interested in. She took 2 courses in sports medicine at St. J Academy. She also was able to participate in an athletic program, which wasn't there. Now, I know athletics is not curriculum, it's extracurricular, but it's part of the full program that kids experience when they're in high school. That's just one experience. But there are 2 other students in that school. One was a tremendous achiever, and the programs offered just didn't challenge that student. That student went off to another school where they are and just advancing wonderfully. The other student was a special service youngster who was being tuitioned into Woodsville from another school, another town, and that student was costing the school district monies for aid and all this, paraprofessional, And the student really wasn't making that progress that he should be. He's now in another school, flourishing, and at less cost than it cost in the school that in the resident district. So we have reasons why they leave: academics, the academic challenge, bullying, social emotional issues, and parents are looking for that best fit. The eligibility portion, I'm not going to speak to the eligibility, or how a child can qualify and how a parent can qualify to enter into this program. I'm going to ask that Representative Cordelli speak to the eligibility portions of this bill and to the accountability sections of this bill. Glenn?
Lower that a little bit. Thank you. These are areas that we've worked very hard on in the Education Committee over the summer and the fall. To start out with eligibility, basic eligibility is that you're at least 5 years old and not more than 20 years old. That's the first criteria, as with any student. Then it's sort of an a la carte menu, one from column A and one from column B. So in column A, we basically have the attendance requirements. And there are three options there. You're currently attending a public school and have been for a year. You received an education savings account in the prior year, or third, you're entering kindergarten or first grade. So if you meet one of those three, then you go on to column B. The criteria there are four possibilities. First, that your family income is less than or equal to 300% of federal poverty. For a family of four, that's $73,800. Second option is that you've been assigned to a school that has been underperforming for 2 consecutive years, and that is underperforming according to state statutes. The third option is that you're a special needs student. And the fourth option is that you tried to get your child into a charter school, but maybe because of a lottery they did not get into that charter school, or they tried to get into the business tax credit scholarship program, but there wasn't enough money available to fund your child's application. So those are the criteria. If you have one from column A and one from column B, you would qualify for the program. And that's just qualify. We've got some preliminary numbers from the Department of Education. They're reviewing the numbers, but according to those initial numbers, approximately 50% of the students in New Hampshire would meet one of those column B criteria. So let's talk about accountability.
Can you take a quick question?
Sure, on eligibility? Yeah.
Well, on eligibility.
Okay.
What does UPI mean? And when you talk about 300% of, I think it's FPG, my eyes are not good. Today, what dollar threshold is that?
Federal poverty guidelines for a family of four is $73,800.
73.8?
Yep.
Thank you. And what's
Right.
UPI?
The universal pupil identifier.
Okay, thank you.
That is used in the public school system and also used as a means of checking students when they go into the business tax credit scholarship program. Accountability, I think, is a strong point of this bill at this point. Much work has been done here, both on the education accountability and financial accountability areas. First, let's deal with education. Okay, well, let me hit this point since we're talking about eligibility on this slide. The question had come up, why 300% of federal poverty? For free and reduced lunch qualification, the criteria is 185% of federal poverty limit. And we chose 300% for several reasons. One, there are a number of programs in the state that use that figure, including child care programs from the Department of Health and Human Services. And actually in some age groups, it goes up to 400% of federal poverty. And we also looked at a study from Pennsylvania that found that the range, the family income range between 235 and 300%. In many cases, those were the most at-risk students because students in lower income brackets received additional services, and above that had the ability to, because of family income, maybe to have additional choice options that others did not have. So that's where the 300% came from. Okay, this sort of gets into the the education accountability section. And in order to, when you get education savings accounts, there are certain acceptable uses spelled out in the legislation. These are the only uses that that savings account can be used for. One of them, as indicated here, is non-public school attendance, and that could be either a private academy, a school accredited by the DOE, or a national accrediting organization that they select, or approved via an interstate compact. As Chairman Ladd was talking about, we have schools in the east and west side of the states that have interstate compacts with schools in Vermont and Maine. Representative Moffitt?
Yeah, thank you. I want to pass on a question that I didn't have a definitive answer to regarding this slide. If a student's going to Manchester Memorial and wants to go to Pinkerton Academy, would this apply or not? Manchester Memorial Public School, Pinkerton Academy is a public academy. So anyway,
do you know if Pinkerton is a public academy? Private.
It's private, but we have of course, what we've done here in the state of New Hampshire, we have a number of schools which are public/private. For example, I talked earlier about the academy up my way, which happens to be in Vermont.
St. Johnsbury.
St. Johnsbury Academy. That school has 210 boarding students and 640 roughly that are day students, which come in from as far away as the Quebec border, beyond Mount Pillier on the Vermont side, beyond Bethlehem, New Hampshire on our side, and down to Hanover, Lyme area. So it draws in from a huge radius that's both New Hampshire and Vermont. And yes, they are recognized by our department as approved schools for student attendance, and so, Pinkerton as well.
So a student from Memorial could use this program to go to Pinkerton?
If you wanted to take your student from a public school, for example, from West High, and go to another public school, you could take that ESA, use it as tuition money to tuition into that public school. However, the public school always has that right to say, no, we are full, we can't accept, or there may be other reasons too. That's why there are agreements in our tuition agreements that we have, like Vermont has and Maine has, and now New Hampshire with the Croydon bill, where we have an agreement between the school board and the receiving school board.
Great, thanks.
You're welcome.
Yes.
How does this affect? What's the current situation if a student wants to tuition into a different public school district, and I guess this program is not available for families who want their children to do that, and
yeah, I think Representative Ladd was trying to cover that. Yeah. Next.
Oh, and the other question is, there's several schools in this state which already have large endowments and give a number of scholarships to students who have special talents, whether academic or athletic or whatever. So how will they be able to get the funding from this, or
A student Right, thank you for the question. A student who qualifies under the criteria that we just talked about could enter into the program, get an education savings account, and then get another scholarship, possibly from the private school, if that was their choice to go to a particular private school. That would be an option for the parents. Yes?
Good morning. Are there any provisions in this law to ensure that the tax dollars that we pass out are given only to American citizens or legal residents in New Hampshire?
I believe that residency is checked when a student enrolls in a public school, and that you have to be in a public school for at least a year in order, as one of the criteria to gain eligibility for the program. I think that depends on the school district, right?
If you're getting into the business of DACA, we have students that have testified before us in hearing in previous years that are not legal residents of New Hampshire or of the United States. However, throughout all the 50 states, K through 12 education is public, and all students are entitled to participate whether you are a legal resident or not. We've had that occur here, and we've spoken on the floor before, when students find out that they're not legal residents. When they're in high school, their parents finally tell them, and they wonder why they can't go to the University of New Hampshire on in-state tuition. And they played ball and went to school with the kids and all that, all through K through 12. And that is an issue. But K through 12 is public education in our country and open to any child.
I've got a question that I think goes towards what Representative Ladd gave as an example in the public school to public school tuition situation. So a student from their home public school district decides that they want to become a tuition student in a neighboring public school. I believe I heard Representative Ladd say that student could receive their 95% of adequacy into their ESA to use towards that tuition. Does the tuitioned to public school also use that or count that student as part of their average daily membership and receive the adequacy payment from the state in addition to that?
You lost me a little bit on that.
Okay, so basically, student in home, we'll call it the home district public school, and the tuition.
The resident district.
Resident district and a neighboring district, let's say, currently, if the student is attending the resident district school, the resident district would be receiving an adequacy grant from the state.
Correct.
Under the situation that you described, where student would leave resident district and go to another public school, the resident district would no longer receive the adequacy payment because the student is no longer part of the ADM calculation. The student receives 95% of that adequacy grant to use in the student's ESA account, and tuitioned to a neighboring school district then would do what as far as including that student in their average daily membership calculation? And if they did, would they also receive the adequacy payment from the state? So now you've gone from the situation where the state pays one adequacy amount for the student to now a situation where the state may be paying not only the student's ESA but also the tuition.
The student you're talking about, when they arrive at the receiving district, public school district, they are going there because they have received and entered into an agreement not with the sending school, the resident district, but with the scholarship organization. And so there would be no additional funding coming to that receiving school, nor would they be able to collect for that. They would receive only that tuition money, and that's why I qualified my first statement that if the receiving school accepted the student coming in from the resident district.
All right. So is it the present law then that that students who tuition into public schools are not counted as part of the ADM?
If you look at the Croydon bill, or if you look at our school tuition program, which we now have on the books, that program is based upon an agreement made between the two districts, and the sending district is the one who has to pay for that, just as they do right now. If you're a K through 6 district, to go to grades 7 through 12, the sending district pays the receiving district all monies, including special education services.
No, I understand that. I'm talking specifically about the calculation of the Adequacy Grant, and which is based on ADM, and what a school does a public school include tuition students in the calculation of ADM?
I don't believe so. No.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Forgive me because I'm very confused. I have a grandson who currently is in a school district, and the school district has decided that he needed to be into a special school and in another state. What happens to those contracts when this ESA goes into effect? Because right now, the school district is paying that tuition. So what happens when this law goes into effect? And I am concerned about that. Very concerned.
Thank you for the question. If this is a special needs student with an IEP or a 504, that student right now is placed in that school by the district. If the parent was not happy with that situation, they would have the option of signing an agreement, withdrawing their child from that district, and getting an education savings account. They would then be eligible to use that education savings account for the services that they believe are necessary to provide the best education possible for that child.
I know that this is coming up, but I also know that the grant that would be given is probably less than 1/3 of the tuition of a private or another school or another option. So again, my question is, what happens to those agreements? Will they stay in place if the district decides that this is the best placement for the child?
This is a parental choice piece of legislation. It's the parent's choice to remove that child from the current situation and find a better education option for that child. It's the parent's choice, not the district's choice.
Now I'm really confused, and I'm not trying to be.
No, that's fine.
Really
We want you to be clear.
Because again, this child, nobody can afford the tuition where he's at.
And so
the school district decided they cannot provide for this child, so they moved him.
Yes.
And he's doing well there. But once
That's
this
great.
law goes into effect, will they still pay for that?
The parent has no obligation to enter into an agreement for an education savings account. If they are happy with the current services, they can stay where they are and nothing changes. This is just an option for parents who maybe feel that there are better education services available for their child. It's a parent's choice program. And
this bill is very different than what we used to call catastrophic aid, which we eliminated that in the last in our last budget. And it's also very different than an education manifest hardship, too. This does not affect the placement of a student that has an IEP in any district in which that school board, working with the state board, has placed
that child. It won't change.
And in a little while, when we touch on constitutionality, Mr. Keller from the Institute for Justice, I think, has some experience on special education placements that he can also touch on possibly.
Thank you.
Representative.
My question is, and I'm sure we've all heard the same thing through emails and things. We're addressing IEPs and 504s. It's been stated in a lot of the emails that I've received that these institutions that may be favored with the ability to accept students under this program will not or cannot sufficiently service the IEP and 504 students. Could you just address that for all of us? Thank you.
I would go back to the basic point of this legislation, that it's a parent's choice. If the parent is not happy with the current situation and the services that are being provided by their local district, they have the option to enter into an agreement and look for other options. Now, not all private schools, not all other situations might not be the best for that child. I would not, if my child had dyslexia, I would not be sending my child to a school that specialized in treating children with autism, or vice versa. So I think it's finding the best fit, and that's what this is all about, finding the best fit for your child for their educational needs. Even great schools may not be the best fit for every child, and the same applies to children with special needs. Yep.
Excuse me, I'm Drew Klein. I'm head of the Josiah Bartlett Center. I hope, is this too loud? Is this good? Okay. Just to address that, I've heard two questions along the same lines, and just for clarity here, this bill does not change anything in current law regarding IEPs or special education. If you have a kid who has an IEP or doesn't, and you're happy with the public school system, nothing changes. Nothing. All this bill does is say if you are unhappy with the services you're receiving, you may elect to apply for an education savings account, in which case you would be contracting with the state of New Hampshire. You would sign a contract with the state of New Hampshire. That's really important. This is not, excuse me, this is not a voucher bill. This does not send money directly to a private school. This does not do anything of that sort. It allows the parent to decide if the public school environment is working for my child stays there. I don't do anything, and it's great. If I determine that the services being offered my child aren't the best fit, then I may apply for an education savings account. I will have to sign a contract with the state of New Hampshire, and that contract obligates me to use that money to provide an education for my child. So unlike some of the criticisms we've heard recently lobbied at this bill, it does not allow the parents to spend this money on drugs or anything else. You sign a contract. You have to then use that money to provide education services to your child. You have to. You're legally obligated to do that. So I hope that clears it up. It doesn't take money away from public education. It is a different mechanism for providing that education. It allows the parent to contract for educational services. In the past, or currently, what we do now, a school district may contract with a private school. If I have a kid in the school district who has special needs that the school district feels that it can't provide, that district may contract with a private education institution to provide those services. What SB 193 does is allows the parent to enter that contract on behalf of the child. That's the difference. That child could receive a contract from the district, but if the district decides it doesn't want to provide that contract with an outside provider, and that dissatisfies the parent, let's say the parent says, you know what, we need this. There was just a U.S. Supreme Court case earlier this year that dealt with exactly that issue. The kid had an IEP, he was autistic, The parents said, look, what you're providing him is not adequate. The IEP didn't change year to year to year. He's struggling in school. We would like to send him to a school that specializes in autism education or educating autistic students. What the U.S. Supreme Court found in that was that the kid left the program, left the public school, the parents took him out, paid for themselves to go to this private school that specializes in treating autism. The U.S. Supreme Court noted that that kid thrived in that program. Despite having an IEP, despite having all the services that the public school could provide and said that it would provide, the parents determined that these aren't the right services for my particular child. They might be great for other kids, but not for my child. My child needs a different type of education. So they took him out, put him in the school. The kid, behavior issues disappeared, academic performance increased. That happens because sometimes the IEP is great and sometimes it's not. So the parent has the ability to sign that contract on behalf of their child, take them out and provide them those alternative services. That's what the bill does.
If I could just follow on to that also, there's been some communication going around that parents lose rights when they opt for an education savings account. That's not the case. A parent can go into the program, place their special needs child in a private school or with other educational services. If they're not happy with those services, they can always go back to the public school. They're not losing any rights that are guaranteed to them under federal law. I think you're next.
Thank you very much, Representative Cordelli. If I could just follow up on this, and I guess I'd like a legislator to respond with all due respect to our distinguished guests. My understanding is that an IEP must be agreed to by the parent and the school. The parent is on the IEP team, and they all must agree. Fine. For whatever reason, a parent is always free, with this bill or not, to leave the public school system. Nothing can interfere with the parent's right to do that. So, as usually happens, we're talking about the money, not the opportunity to leave the public school. If a parent, without getting the agreement of the school, decides to take their child out of the public school and enter this alternative, I would believe, and like you to counteract that if I'm wrong, that the parent chooses to give up the financial opportunities they get from the IEP program. All across the state of New Hampshire today, we have children in non-public schools in the state and out of the state paid for with the IEP, with public school money.
IDEA money.
Okay, they lose that if they go into this program because they cannot enter into an IEP with a private school without the agreement of the sending school. And we're talking here about a few $1,000s, which is significantly over less, it's just a drop in the bucket, of what the true costs of a particular special education program is. So parents give up a lot.
Well, if I could follow on, yeah, sure. The laws, the federal laws, govern the situation currently today. If a parent takes their child, irregardless of an ESA program, if a parent takes the child out of the public school because they're not satisfied and places them in a private school, there are federal laws that apply. Still, there is what's called a service plan that has to be agreed upon. And the private school would get a prorated share of that IDEA money from the local district who's responsible for providing educational services. The private school would get a prorated share. Now, that might be a small portion of the IDEA money because it might be just one child out of 50 children with special needs. They would get a prorated share at that private school. That's the current law, and that does not change. That still would happen, but now they would have the ESA money in their account to use to pay for that private school as well. And there might well be situations, needs of children that are highly specialized that cost considerably more than the ESA amount or any scholarships that might be available, and the parent might be happy with those services, and that's fine. They can stay where they are.
Would you, when you get a chance, give me the citation of how, if a parent on his or her own decision, without involving the sending school, takes their child out, sends them to a private school of any construct,
Sure.
and will then, by federal law, not state law, but by federal
Yep.
law, have access to special education money that would come from the sending school? If you could give me the citation, I'd
Right,
really
and I
appreciate
have
that.
that from the Department of Education along with their write-up of the process. I'd be glad to give to you.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Thank you.
Read.
This doesn't have to do with an IEP or 504. It has to do with whether you can use ESA funds for sending children to religious schools.
Yes.
Explain a little bit about how that applies.
We'll get into that with
And the
yeah,
Constitution.
on the constitutionality, we'll handle that. But the money is put into an education savings account that the parent can then use to find the best educational services for their child, and that could be a whole host. And on the screen right now, you'll see what the qualifying uses are. So thank you for that segue. It includes.
And also, Glenn, could you, if there's any restrictions on what the student can do or can't do at a religious school, if there are any restrictions as far as what he can or they can attend or cannot attend.
Yeah, we'll get into that with the constitutionality and all also.
Hi. Good morning,
Hi.
Representative. I wanted to clarify something. Well, first of all, I don't, after 40 years in education, I must assert that not all parents are created equal in terms of their ability to judge what's best for their children. I have faith in most, but my experience. But my question is to clarify a point I made in committee. I asked you in committee if a private school could turn away a disabled student. And you said, I think you said, it's up, yes, they could, because they're not under any federal obligation. So here this morning you said it's the parent's choice. But if I have a parent in my school district that wants to go to a particular school that has good special ed services, and they go to see that school could turn them away and said, no, you can't. And what you said in committee was that parents would then have to shop around to try to find a match, I think you said, between their child's disability and the program. But once you go in that arena, it's up to the schools to decide whether or not that child can go there or not. They may take a student with dyslexia, but they may not want another student that's on the spectrum, for example. So that is the situation where the parents are going to have to shop for what that child, by federal law, is entitled to as a free and appropriate education in a least restrictive environment. There's no assurance under this plan, as far as I can tell, that that will actually happen when the parents start shopping their students around. I thank you for being here this morning to answer the question. Thank you.
Sure. Well, thank you for the question. I don't think it's a matter of shopping their student around. What they're looking for are the best education options for that child. If it's not in the public school, they can then look at other options, and it could be any one of the qualifying options that we saw, which it includes a private, non-public school. And there we talk about it right on the slide now. It could be a non-public school. If that, as your example, if that school specializes in children with autism, but they have dyslexia or some other kind of learning disability, they might not want to put that child into that school. The parent might not want to. Or the school, when the parent comes to talk to them, as we heard in testimony, going back to the committee testimony that you referred to, we heard from the head of a private school, when asked about that, said, if we don't think that we can provide the services for that child, we're going to sit down with the parent and explain that to the parent that they should look at another option, because their interest also is finding the best option for that child.
But it is true that if a parent wants their child to go to Landmark, for example, Landmark could turn them away, even though the parent wants their child there, right?
That private school or non-public school might not be the best match for that child for a number of reasons. But if we could hold the rest of the questions, we're getting a little bit behind on our slides.
Just to summarize, because we really do need to move on with these slides and get into the fiscal and into the constitutionality of this thing. There are a number, as a school administrator and principal and fourth grade teacher for over 30 years, I've seen all this. And I've seen some schools identifying students with a special education handicap, calling it a learning disability. What it really is, in some cases, a learning difference. It means the learning style and the teaching style don't parallel. They're not aligned. And students have not been able to progress the way they are really capable of doing so. The school never identified the teaching style that was necessary for this child to learn. And when you, as a parent, see that and know your child has ability, but it's not generating it, you look for choice. And this is what's happening with some of these programs where people are sending their kids to other schools. They're not interested in having an IEP. They're interested in their child being taught the way their child learns. And so those are some of the reasons. Yes, all kids won't leave a public school because they're getting a better education there. That's not what this program's all about. It's about giving parents the choice.
I'll just try and go through quickly the additional education and financial accountability provisions. First of all, as we talked about, the parent signs an agreement for the education savings account, and there are only defined, specialized savings accounts expenses that are allowed, including tuition, textbooks, online learning, tuition, college admission tests. Those are all spelled out, and in most cases, there would be probably a restricted use debit card issued for the education expenses that would be restricted to these uses, and all of those uses and receipts will be checked by a scholarship organization to make sure that they are valid expenses. The Department of Education may remove non-compliant students from the program. Parents are basically responsible for the education of their children. That's the main goal, objective of this program, is to make sure that parents are responsible for the children's education. Education service providers are annually to establish goals for the student's academic process and monitor those goals. The non-public schools must administer an annual assessment, and the results are sent to the Commissioner of Education. Parent provides the scholarship organization with other demonstrations of educational progress if they're not in a private school or non-public school. And for any student with an account not showing achievement and growth, it's mandated that there be an intervention plan developed to monitor the student's growth going forward. On to the financial accountability, which is another strong point, I think, and is even stronger than some of the other states that have implemented education savings accounts, of which there are 5. There's an automatic termination of the program if the student moves out of state. The monies are returned to the Treasury. If the department feels that the family is non-compliant with the eligibility requirements, the funds are returned to the Treasury. And if there is substantial fraudulent misuse of those monies, there is a requirement to report that to the Attorney General's office. Non-public schools can be barred from the program if they do not adhere to the requirements of the program as well. The scholarship organization produces annual reports and does an annual independent audit. And we went a step further and established a legislative oversight committee that will also look at the program on an annual basis and issue their reports and recommendations. But remember again, this is only a 5-year pilot program. At the end of the 5 years, that that legislative oversight commission will issue a final report with recommendations as to whether the program should proceed and recommendations for the future of the program. So that's a quick overview of the accountability provisions. Do you want to go to financial next?
Yeah, I think there was one more slide there. There was some questioning about homeschooling, and what we have up here is parental choice advocates should consider making concessions to public's concerns over accountability, and that we've done. If you're going to receive money in this particular bill or in the ESA, you're going to be held to a higher standard if you're a homeschooler. There is going to be accountability to ensure that, to the scholarship organization, that the money is being used appropriately, and that is for the child's learning. Okay, I'd like to have Drew Klein now. We have a section up here, ESA's Myth or Reality, and then we also have Drew speaking towards the fiscal impacts to your community, to your schools, and to the parents. You want to come up here and speak, Drew?
I can do it here. This is fine. I want to be able to reference if I need to. So thank you for having me. I just want to make clear that I am here as president of the Josiah Bartlett Center for Public Policy, and I'm speaking for the Josiah Bartlett Center, no one else. So I want to make that clear for everybody who might have questions about that. Okay.
You are also the chairman of the State Board of Education, are you not? So how does it?
Correct.
So how does that affect your role here, speaking on behalf of the?
Not at all. I mean, if anything, it's in the experience of hearing parents come to the state board has given me a little bit deeper perspective on the problems that many parents might have finding a right fit for their kid. But I'm not speaking on behalf of the state board in any way. Just want that to be clear. So at the Josiah Bartlett Center, we decided to take a look at the fiscal impact this might have on your local school district. There's been a lot of talk about school districts losing money. And a couple of things to understand here. First of all, the bill is an option for parents. So if SB 193 passes, it allows parents to contract with the state, as I've stated before, and then contract with a private provider. So state law, RSA 193, requires New Hampshire to provide, as the law states, an opportunity for an adequate education. That's what the law says. My understanding of this bill is that this would be one mechanism for allowing parents, let me put it this way, for allowing the state to meet that obligation, right? So it's just not the case that most people would want an ESA, right? This doesn't destroy the public school system. It doesn't dismantle the public school system. I personally am a huge believer in the public education system we have in New Hampshire. It is a fantastic system. This does not undermine the public education system. What this does is it says to parents who might have a child who's not as well served under this 20th century industrial model that we have for public education, here's an alternative, right? Right now, what New Hampshire has done to meet that obligation to provide an adequate opportunity, or an opportunity for an adequate education, we built this big system, right, with all these public schools. Those public schools, by law, are allowed to contract. In fact, New Hampshire has always had some mechanism of contracting with private providers for public education, dating back to at least the 1790s. So this is nothing new. The idea that you would meet that obligation to provide an adequate education by contracting with a private provider. That has happened in New Hampshire for centuries. What SB 193 does is it says, if you meet these conditions for eligibility, the parent may contract with a private provider. That I think is just really important to understand. So passing SB 193 would not automatically cost anybody any money. Like, in order for a school district to quote unquote lose money, if SB 193 passes, a parent would have to decide to contract with a private provider, apply for that scholarship, get accepted for the scholarship, then contract with a private provider. So if your local public school is your, as we call them, resident school, if your resident school is satisfying the needs of every family, then SB 193 should be no impact, because why would anybody leave? What it would do, it was allow those parents who might have a child who doesn't really work well in that system, right? And we've seen this over and over again. We have kids in New Hampshire who are taking education scholarships who have had those issues. This would be a small percentage of students. In Florida, which has the largest school choice program in the country, the first-year take-up rate is about 1%. So it's just not the case that you're going to get some large percentage that are going to flee the public schools. So what we looked at would be, what would happen to district budgets if 1% of students in that district left, took an ESA and left? What would happen if 5% of students in a district took an ESA and left? You'll hear a lot of people say, oh my gosh, that's going to cost so much money. So let me get to my document here. What we found was that we took that.
What they have is they have the exact person.
Yep.
And say they have that, and then they have.
If everybody had, this is just one example, I didn't print this up, but it's Littleton. So this would just give you sort of an example of what we're talking about. So what we did was we calculated the cost. So we took the state adequate education grant. Under SB 193, a kid would qualify for 95% of that state adequate education grant, plus 100% of any additional differentiated aid. So if this child had no differentiated aid, they would get just the 95% of the adequate education grant. But if the child had, for example, an IEP or was eligible for free and reduced lunch, they would be getting differentiated aid. They would be able to take 100% of that as well. And I think this kind of addresses the question somebody had earlier, right? So if you have a kid who has an IEP and is getting differentiated aid for that, they take that money with them, and it helps cover the cost of that education at whatever other alternative they choose.
Excuse me, what's
IEP is an individual educational program. So if you have a kid with any sort of identified special educational needs, under federal law and the practice in New Hampshire is once your kid's identified as having those special needs, the school and the parents sit down together and create what is called an individual educational program for those kids. The law is just something to clarify as well. So the parents are involved in that process. But if the parents and the school disagree, ultimately the school administration can impose it. They have the ultimate say on what the IEP. The parents don't have to agree to it, but I shouldn't say impose it, right? The district has the ultimate authority on the IEP. The parents, are in the end subject to. They don't necessarily have veto power over everything that goes in there. So there has to be an agreement, but under the law, the district is ultimately in charge of the IEP. So anyway, if you get your IEP, you have a certain amount of money that your kid gets to provide those services. That would go with you. So it would help cover special education costs if you go to a non-public school or get a tutor, for example, under SB 193. So anyway, getting back to the analysis we did. So we looked at all of that money, right? Not just the 90% of your adequate education grant, but if we averaged it up to include kids who have differentiated aid. So it's a bit of a larger impact. We estimated this to have a bit of a high impact. We don't really know how many kids with IEPs, for example, or free and reduced eligible will go, but we took that average for districts and tried to get an accurate look there. So the impact could be smaller than this. And what we found was if 1% of students statewide go for an ESA, apply and get accepted, local school districts will keep 99.7% of their operating budgets. If 5% of students statewide, now that is a big number. As I said, Florida's take-up rate initially is about 1%. That tends to be typical for any sort of school choice programs, about 1% in the first year. 5% would be a really large take-up rate. The statewide average school district would keep 98.7% of its operating budget. So you can go through our data. We did this for every school district that we could find data for. And I'll just start with Allenstown. So Allenstown, as we know, is a property poor district. If they had 1% of students get an ESA, that would be 5 students. That would be $21,950 leaving the school district. But they keep 99.8% of their budget. So that puts it in context, right? You understand that the raw number might look big, but it's a very, very small percentage of the budget. Let's go to Manchester, just to get you some big numbers. 1% take-up rate in Manchester would be $584,870. That would be ESA money going out. But Manchester keeps 99.6% of its budget. So it's really important to understand these figures in percentage context. And this is without stabilization grants. And I want to make that very clear. These districts, if 1% takes up ESAs, we calculated that 99.7% of the budget would stay intact. That's without a stabilization grant. We did this analysis on the Senate version of the bill because we wanted to show a sort of the big impact. Stabilization grants obviously would kick in under the House version of the bill that will be up for a vote this week. So if a district loses 1/4% of its budget, everything over 1/4% will be given back to the district. So, great, yeah, so we have copies of our report. If anybody wants to go through, you can find your district. If your district is missing, that only means that the state didn't provide data for that on its website.
Yes, if I could. Again, just going back to the families we particularly care about because the children have special needs. I am looking at a document, Guide to the New Hampshire Standards for the Education of Children with Disabilities. And on page 106, it says, no individual right to special education and related services. No parentally placed private school child with a disability has an individual right to receive some or all of the special education and related services that the child would receive if enrolled in a public school. Now, this goes on, and I don't want to take everybody's time, but every point after that just supports the fact that if the parent and the school work together and agree on a placement, whether it's in a private or a public school, the IEP applies. Once the parent makes a choice without the support of the school district to take that child out of the school district, there is no individual right, not under my interpretation, but under your interpretation. So I still see the fact that we are saying to parents of children who are unhappy with the public school, they should not stay and fight to get the quality of education that their child needs, but just go out, and if they could find a school that would take their child for the few $1,000s, they do not take with them the money necessary to fund their IEP. Now, unless this document is wrong.
Can I answer the question?
Yes.
Thank you. Great question. I'm glad you pointed that out. The way it works, if you stay in the public school, what you have access to, let's understand what we're talking about here. What you actually have access to in your local public school is the IEP program. What we're saying here is that works for a lot of kids. But not every kid, even with an IEP, is best served under that model. That's what we're saying, right? So if that's the case, if a parent decides, look, as some parents have, as this Andrew F. case before the U.S. Supreme Court this past year, if the parent decides the IEP is not working for my child as well as I would like it to, my kid's not making the progress, I can then choose, and it's entirely up to the parent to choose to do that, nobody's being forced, to try to find an alternative that would work better. Now, if a parent does that, they do take their differentiated aid with them. So the differentiated aid portion does go under SB 193. It's maybe $1,400, $1,500, whatever it happens to be. The misnomer, I think the misunderstanding is, federal law does not say to the private school, you have to provide an IEP. That is correct. It does not say that. Under New Hampshire rules, the State Department of Education issued rules in March. Any parent-elected move, so if a parent chooses to place a kid in a private educational institution, under our current rules in New Hampshire, the local school district has to meet with that private provider and they have to come up with a plan. So it's not, you don't have a right to an IEP, but the district, the local school has to communicate, tell the private provider what the needs are, and they have to come up with shared information and say, here's how we're going to address those special needs. It's not specifically an IEP, and here's what I think the confusion is. The assumption is, well, my goodness, if you're not guaranteed an IEP, you're being abandoned to the wolves, right? You're not going to have the special needs met. That is not true. All it says is it doesn't have to come in the form of this IEP. The parent is electing to find an alternative, because what we know is, for some small percentage of students, an IEP is required to be created to fit that child as best as possible within the sort of mainstream curriculum, right? It's an additional services, but the law states that it's supposed to be less disruptive, as least disruptive as possible, right? And that's the goal. But there are a small percentage of kids who might need a different type of education, who might need a different type of service. For example, a specialized autism school. I mean, that's just one example. All this SB 193 does is it allows the parent to contract with that outside provider to provide that service. If the parent finds that service is dissatisfactory, they can go back to the public school and everything kicks back in again. They've lost nothing, right? They have the ability to get their IEP, they go back to the public school. So look at it this way, the public school with the IEP and anything else that is given as special needs is the default position. We are providing all kids with that. A parent under SB 193 may elect to choose a different type of education. It's up to the parent to decide if that different type of education will be preferable to an IEP. I think there's a lot of attitude from some folks that nothing can be preferable to an IEP. Nothing can be preferable to the type of specialized education that will be given in the kid's district school or resident school. That's not the case for every parent. That's not the case for every family. For some people, an alternative is preferable. That's all SB 193 does. It gives them the option of taking that alternative. If they try it and find that it didn't work like they thought, they can go back to the public school, have their IEP, have those services.
Let me just interject for a second here. The amount of money we're talking about here, it's different for this bill than it is for a tuition bill like the Croydon bill, which we did last year. This is where the money goes to a savings account in the name of the child, and it's a voluntary thing. They take the base adequacy, which is $3,636. They take the differentiated aid special education monies, which is $1,956. And if you qualify for low income or free and reduced, you take your $1,818. You get 95% of that. That's what you receive to provide your child that education through your education savings account, period. You do not give up your rights for IEP ever. You won't be receiving it the way you received it in the public school. If you choose to come back to the public school, that IEP is still good. You still qualify. You could get your service back there. As Mr. Klein has said, it's the default. It defaults back to the school district if you so inclined. But you're making a choice where you feel, I can get service for my child through this program over here. It doesn't replicate the IEP program, but I feel that's a better program for my child. This happened to a student up in my community, and they found going to the school where the IEP wasn't followed the way it was in the sending district, huge dollars were saved and great growth in the child. This is an individual choice made by the family and the student. You're not going to get exactly what was happening in your sending district, your resident district. If you want that, you stay there.
Yes, thank you.
Representative Lay.
Chairman, thank you. Mr. Klein, you have referenced twice the Supreme Court case regarding Andrew F. And under SB 193, if a parent so chose to remove their child and pursue a private school, they would receive 95% of roughly $7,000 to $8,000. However, because the parents actually went through the IEP process, through the pursuit of not accepting their current school, the special education, LEA, and the public school wound up paying 100% of all of the costs for Andrew to receive the education he needed. My question is, how do we not sound disingenuous in telling parents they have a choice to only pay 95% when the due process worked out to be 100% for that parent, for that child, and the parents didn't have to pay a dime?
I'm not sure I quite understand how. I don't really understand the question. How is it dishonest or disingenuous to?
I think to promote an ESA based on the Andrew F. Supreme Court decision, where 100% of that child's needs were covered when the public school, the special education department, the LEA, saw fit to change the school that child was going to. It was covered 100% versus the 95% of $7,000 or $8,000. I would imagine that the school that this child is going to is roughly 3 times that amount. I just find it disingenuous that we're using that Supreme Court case to justify to parents of special needs children that a choice under this scenario will wind up being less.
No, okay, so I think I get what you're saying. My reference to the Andrew F. case was to point out that there are children who are not best served in the current model. He was one example of a child that was better served with a different type of education. The antidote applies regardless of whether he particularly got 100% or 95%. The point was that there are kids who have certain specialized needs that are better served in different types of environments. That's the point. And under SB 193, the parent gets a large chunk of money to find that alternative environment. That's the point. So the parent will go, if they elect for an ESA, they will get to take that money and find the type of education that best fits their kids' needs. If they think that the best educational fit is in the public school, they stay there. So it's not dishonest. I mean, that's just the way the model works, right?
No, the way the model works, sir, respectfully, is that the public school saw fit to place Andrew F. in a private school at one
That's
point.
not
right.
correct.
What happened in Andrew F. was that the school district refused to put him where the parents wanted him. So the parents unilaterally removed Andrew from the public school, placed him in a private school, and started paying the tuition there out of their own pocket. They then hired lawyers to sue the district for that money and took it all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court.
Yes.
By the time it reached the Supreme Court, Andrew F. had graduated. He was gone. The parents did ultimately receive reimbursement, but they had to pay all of that out of their own costs, plus attorney's fees.
So the system worked eventually.
The system worked because they got sued? That's not correct.
That's a huge risk that parents have to take.
I think we need to be completely honest about this.
We are being honest about it. Andrew F., they had to sue the district. That was not a district placement. Nobody's being dishonest here. The point is
I disagree, thank you.
Well, I appreciate you calling me dishonest, but that's not, in fact, the case. The point is, as I've said a couple of times, I'll just try to make it clearer, the Andrew F. case was a kid who was not best served by his IEP. The parents went to the school district and said, look, we've had 3 or 4 years of not good academic growth here. We want a different IEP, and the school district gave them the same IEP again. And they said, this is not good enough for our son. We're going to take him out, and they paid 100% of the tuition out of their own pockets for the school.
Okay, I'd like to break in for a second here. We're going to start the constitutional portions of this in about 3 minutes here. So there are 3 people waiting to speak here. So let's give each a minute, please, so we can get to the next level where we need to get. Thank you. Which one? Representative Tanner?
Thank you. Thank you. I have a question. You had said that if a person, a parent takes their child out of school, a special needs child, and goes with the ESA, and things don't work out, they can always go back to the public school. Currently, I'm working on a school budget as part of a budget committee, and I'm wondering, after the budget is set and after the tax rate is set, if a child is on an ESA and all of a sudden decides to come back to the public school midway and costs hundreds of thousands of dollars that weren't appropriated or weren't funded in the first place, how that's good for either the school district, the parent, or the child.
I think the answer to that question is that enrollment fluctuates year to year all the time. So you may get a kid in the middle of the year who comes in and needs an IEP regardless. I mean, that happens every year. So our study looked at fluctuations in enrollment, and what we found was from 2010 to 2015, the statewide average in New Hampshire was a 7% change in enrollment. It was a 7% reduction. But year to year, that might go up, it might go down. It's not the case that school budgets are fixed because the enrollment is fixed year to year. Enrollment changes a lot, and schools have to deal with those. They have variable costs, and they should have revenues built in to accommodate these situations. So, I mean, SB 193 does not change the fact that a local school district may at any time, a parent may move. I mean, so I live in Bedford. We have parents who move to Bedford to go to the public schools all the time. Sometimes they move in. It's a large commuter community. New Hampshire, you have parents who relocate here for jobs. They come in the middle of the school year. You're going to get that kid regardless, and you're going to have to adjust your costs based on that. I mean, SB 193 doesn't change that.
Okay, let's move on to the next representative. You can see the enrollment, how it changed for Littleton on the screen there, where the average enrollment change year to year was 3%, but from 2010 to 2015, there's a 14% decrease in enrollment. Representative.
Mr. Klein, I have exactly the opposite question. Is it not true that if a parent with SB 193 passes and the parent decides that he's found, or he and she have found a better alternative for their child, decide to enroll, and that child happened to have an IEP at the previous district, is it not true, at least in theory, that that district can reduce that budget item because that parent has satisfied a program that may or may not include an IEP at a private school?
Right. So in theory, when the school, so if a kid, regardless of whether the kid has special needs, differentiated aid, when that kid leaves the district no longer is obligated to educate that child. And what our study showed is that because the vast majority of a district's funding is local property taxes and federal money, that state portion that leaves is a very small percentage of the state's operating budget. So when the kid leaves, not only do you lose a small percentage of your budget, you keep, as we looked at, so if 1% of students leave, the average district keeps 99.7% of its funding, of its operating budget, but they no longer have to educate those children. So what I think you can project with what you can probably expect from this is that we hear a lot with school choice that it's going to cream, right? It's going to take the cream of the crop, the best kids. That's not actually been the case in practice. Florida is another good example. In Florida, which has the largest school choice program in the country, the average test scores of the kids entering the school choice program are lower than the average statewide test score. So we see that it does attract kids who are struggling to succeed in the public schools. Those resident schools no longer have to educate those kids who are struggling to find the right fit in that public school. That is one of the beauties of a program like this, is that if you have a kid with special needs and those special needs aren't being met, you know, the school district will get that $1,900, but we all know it probably costs a lot more than that $1,900 to provide those services to that kid. So the kid's going to leave, and you know, depending on the numbers and how many we're talking about, very well may reduce the cost overall to the local school when you have these children leave.
Okay, we need one more because we're already over on to Mr. Keller's.
Theoretically, then, if you have a number of children that leave and achieve the same purpose in a private school, theoretically, the school district can reduce its budget.
Yes.
Thank you.
Just one really quick question. Is someone going to address the finances? Because I see Representative Kirk. I'm one who can't balance my checkbook, but I'm wondering where all this money is going to come from out of the air, and is the federal money that's coming for disabled children going to be factored into this? So I hope somebody's going to address that at some point.
Thank you.
This is the state. The SB 183 money is state money. It's not federal money. So the school district keeps whatever federal money it has.
Yeah, sure.
It's my understanding that that is the practice, but you might want to have Chairman Ladd follow up on that.
Well, this is why we have such wonderful people on Division 2.
Just to address the money, remember that the House version of this bill, the bill that's up for vote, does have stabilization grants, so the district will be getting money. So everything over 1/4% loss, the district will be getting money back to educate a kid that's not there.
And that amount of money is less than what we appropriated last year for concurrent and dual enrollment, which was $1.8 million. I believe the projection is $1.4 million. Tim Keller, constitutionality. Do you want to come up here and use this mic?
Well, if Star Wars taught me anything as a kid, it's that the Empire always strikes back. For over 25 years, the Institute for Justice has been defending school choice programs all across the country. In fact, in that time, there has not been a single day that we haven't been in court somewhere in this country defending a school choice program from legal attack. That includes the case Duncan v. State, which challenged your scholarship tax credit program. IJ was involved in the defense of that program. I was involved in the defense of that program, all the way up to the New Hampshire Supreme Court. Of course, the court ultimately decided that the plaintiffs in that case didn't have legal standing and did not address the merits of that case, but the program is presumably constitutional. The way that we do this, the way that the Institute for Justice gets involved, is that we represent parents and students, and we intervene on their behalf in the legal challenge that is typically filed by groups like the teachers' unions or the ACLU or Americans United for Separation and Church of State against the state. And so we represent those parents pro bono to defend the program's constitutionality. And I'm going to tell you about one of the clients we represented in Arizona when we defended Arizona's ESA program. His name was Austin Fox. Austin has Asperger's syndrome, which is basically a high-functioning autism. One of the interesting things about Austin was that he was attending a public school that was bending over backwards to meet his needs. They made all the accommodations they could possibly make for Austin, but they couldn't place him in a self-contained classroom with other kids for special needs because he was just too smart. But he was struggling in his regular public school classrooms because of the sensory issues that he faced. So in this room right now, there are a number of ambient sounds in the background, keyboards clicking, doors opening, and our ears filter those out. But the way that Austin's mom described his experience was that being in a room like this would be like standing in the middle of a Las Vegas casino. And as a result, he just could not function in his public school classrooms, no matter how hard they tried to accommodate him. As a sophomore, he was getting a 2.0 GPA, and he was ready to drop out. That's when Arizona adopted their ESA program. Austin's mom said, "Would you please consider finding a school that maybe could meet your needs?" And so Austin agreed. He shopped. He found a small, private Christian school. Now, Austin was an atheist, and the school said that they only admitted students who would sign their statement of faith. But Austin sat down with the headmaster and said, "I will not disrupt your school. I will be respectful. I will attend your religious courses and not make a fuss." And the headmaster said, "You're welcome here." Now, Austin received $19,000 from Arizona's ESA program because they included all of the special funding weights in their calculation. But he only spent $6,000 at the school. The school's environment was such that it was almost like a homeschool environment, where he would work at his own pace, and when he needed direction, he would go to one of the master teachers that was available for him. In 2 years' time, Austin took his GPA from a 2.0 to a 4.0 GPA and only spent $12,000. He scored in the 98th percentile on the SAT, and he got a scholarship to attend ASU Polytechnic campus. Now, I'm not aware of any other program that could take a student from a 2.0 GPA to a 4.0 GPA in 2 years' time and help him get a scholarship to go to college and save the state that type of money. That's really powerful. Now the question is a program like that constitutional in the state of New Hampshire? And I say the answer is yes. So there are two provisions of your Constitution that are likely to be invoked, and they're up here on the screen. Part 1, Article 6, which is your what's commonly referred to as a compelled support clause. This is essentially the clause of your Constitution that disestablished your official state church. And that's what your Supreme Court recognizes it as. That's what other state constitutions and other state Supreme Courts with similar language has recognized this. And here, on a program like this, nobody is compelled to support religious education. This program is entirely voluntary. And when the state creates this program and parents enter into an agreement with the state, not $1 of the money that is deposited into an ESA is predestined for any particular use. Parents decide how to use the money. They have basically an a la carte menu to choose from under this program. And we've been talking a lot about special education services. One of the uses that parents can choose to pay for are, in fact, special education and related therapies. So if a private school that they've chosen to attend doesn't provide those services, if there's money left over in their account, they can use it to buy the services that may not be provided by that school. That's one of the options that's created under this program. The other provision, Part 2, Article 83, is what is commonly known as a Blaine Amendment. It says, no money raised by taxation shall ever be granted or applied for the use of the schools or institutions of any religious sect or denomination. This provision restricts state action. It doesn't restrict individual action. So I think if we look at just the plain text, there's a strong argument that these provisions simply don't apply to a student assistance program where parents have a genuine choice as to how to use their funds. But then if we also consider the historical reasons for these provisions, this provision here, Article 83, was adopted to prevent, the state from funding Catholic schools alongside what was then its predominantly Protestant public school system. Stated another way, this provision was adopted to favor and protect Protestant public schools from private Catholic schools. It has a thoroughly anti-Catholic and anti-religious sentiment in its adoption. Now, fortunately, the New Hampshire Supreme Court has said, not in a legal decision, but rather in one of its advisory opinions, that they construe this language to require the state of New Hampshire to be religiously neutral when it comes to providing public benefits to individuals and how those individuals use those benefits. I'm going to skip ahead 2 slides. So in one of their opinions, again, this is not binding legal precedent. This is just an advisory opinion. However, New Hampshire Supreme Courts often will look to their advisory opinions as persuasive authority and cite them in their published decisions. They said, it is our opinion that since secular education at sectarian schools, that was the frame of reference in this case, serves a public purpose, it may be supported by tax money if sufficient safeguards are provided to prevent more than an incidental and indirect benefit to a religious sect or denomination. And so where does the court look to determine the appropriate safeguards? They look to federal precedent. 4 times, the New Hampshire Supreme Court, in advisory opinions, have been confronted with the issue of public funding at religious institutions, and every single time they have looked to federal precedent to determine what the appropriate safeguards are. So what are the appropriate safeguards according to the U.S. Supreme Court? Well, in 2002, the U.S. Supreme Court considered a Cleveland school voucher program in which parents were permitted to use their benefits at religious schools. And the Supreme Court said that use constitutes only an incidental and indirect benefit so long as, number 1, the state is completely religiously neutral, and number 2, parents exercise a genuine choice as to where to send their students. And religious neutrality, the Supreme Court said, meant that the state could neither favor nor disfavor religion. Could neither favor nor disfavor religion. So that program allowed parents to choose religious schools, and the Supreme Court said that's fine. So as long as the New Hampshire Supreme Court follows its past opinions, its past advisory opinions, and says we will look to the U.S. Supreme Court to determine what those appropriate safeguards are, this program will pass constitutional muster. Now, one question arises: could a state decide to exclude religion? The Cleveland, Ohio program included religion, but could you exclude? I believe the answer is no. A recent decision from the U.S. Supreme Court arising out of the state of Missouri under Missouri's Blaine Amendment, which is very similar to your Part 2, Article 83, the state of Missouri tried to exclude a religious school from an otherwise neutral grant program. In the case Trinity Lutheran v. Comer, the program at issue allowed private schools to be reimbursed for using ground-up scrap tires to resurface playgrounds. And a religious preschool operated by Trinity Lutheran Church applied for that program and was denied participation simply because it was a religious school. And the U.S. Supreme Court said, you can't do that. You cannot exclude a religious organization from this program simply because it's religious. That violates the free exercise clause of the U.S. Constitution. I believe this decision, coupled with the statement in Zellman v. Simmons-Harris, where the Supreme Court upheld Ohio's voucher program, that you can neither favor nor disfavor religion, means that it would be unconstitutional under the federal Constitution to exclude religious schools from your ESA program. Now, the current provision, the current draft includes religious schools and allows parents to choose religious schools if that is their preference. And because it is their preference and they are the ones exercising the decision, I believe that SB 193 is constitutional and will pass constitutional muster under both the federal Constitution and the New Hampshire state Constitution. I'm going to conclude with one more story, because this issue of special needs students has come up repeatedly this morning. I represented another client in Arizona. Her name was Andrea Weck. Andrea's daughter, Lexi, when she was 4 years old, entered the public school system and did wonderfully. And for 2 years, she thrived and made tremendous progress. However, when she was 6 years old and in first grade, the progress ceased. And Andrea, as part of the IEP team, presented them with a private school that she believed could meet Lexi's needs. And her public school district said, no, we're not going to place her in that private school. We believe we have a program here that will keep her safe, maybe make some learning gains, but that what we're content with providing her with that. And so Andrea took an ESA. At this point, her choice was either go through the due process procedures, which would have required her to go through an entire administrative process that could take years. I used to serve as a volunteer lawyer for the Arizona Disability, the Arizona Center for Disability Law, and as in that capacity, I would represent parents pro bono in the due process procedure, and it could take years. And by the time you finally prevail, the district now owes services backward, but then you have to fight to make sure they actually provide those backward services. It's not always an easy process. So Andrea could have done that, or Andrea could have unilaterally removed Lexi and placed her in a private school and sued the district for reimbursement of those costs. But Andrea at that time was working, she was a single mother, 3 kids, working as a hairdresser. She couldn't afford those type of legal bills. She couldn't afford to pay the private school tuition out of pocket. But Arizona had a school choice program. And so Andrea applied for that program. Lexi actually received something in the neighborhood of $21,000 for her disabilities. And then with a little bit of help from family and friends, Andrea was able to make up the difference of the tuition and kept Lexi at that school. Today, I met Lexi in 2006. She's the same age as my oldest son, so she is now 17. She's now at a school called Beyond Autism. Lexi, by the way, has autism, cerebral palsy, and mild mental retardation. She's now at a school called Beyond Autism that her mom founded. And what that school does is it focuses not just on academics, but on life skills. So the students at that school learn how to do simple tasks like making a bed, shopping at a grocery store, making change. Almost all of the students at Beyond Autism are there because of Arizona's ESA program. The school was created and designed to serve students with autism, and they've created their entire curriculum and tuition amounts to match as best they can the typical amount a student in Arizona receives for an ESA. So we've seen new schools open up. We've seen innovative approaches to educating students. And it's all because the state of Arizona stepped up to the plate and passed its ESA program. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions, and I'm here to say that we will be here to defend Arizona's ESA program, or New Hampshire's ESA program, should SB 193 pass.
If I may, Representative Guthrie, I know we're getting down to the close to the end, and I don't know if there's been any discussion at all about the number of students we have whose families have already made the choice. They're not going to be taken out of the school system, but they're already out there as homeschoolers or in an academy or something like that at the cost of the parent. Is this program going to end up subsidizing those choices that have already been made? And has anybody made an investigation of the cost of that, if that is a fact, if they are going to be subsidized?
The House version that we'll be dealing with this week, those children who have already been placed in a private school or are being homeschooled do not meet the eligibility requirements under this version of the SB 193.
Why?
The Education Committee worked with the original bill as passed by the Senate, which was more universal in terms of who was eligible. Based on the feedback from the committee and trying to answer the concerns of all committee members, we put into place in this version eligibility requirements that we discussed earlier and that we can certainly provide to you. And basically, there are 6 or 7 eligibility requirements that must be met.
Could they go back into the system for a short period of time and then qualify?
One of the first eligibility requirements is that they have to currently be in a public school for 1 year period in order to qualify for an account.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That just opened up more questions, as my grandson is in a school-placed academy. To go back into the constitutionality, I'm not sure if New Hampshire has any strings on state money, meaning non-discriminatory practices in hiring as far as private school goes, non-discriminatory practices in benefits, and if they do, how is that going to be addressed or monitored? I'm not sure, and the amounts that you mentioned were considerable more than the drop in the bucket that New Hampshire is, 19,000, 21,000. So we're not even getting close to paying for this education. So can you answer those questions and the constitutionality of that particular problem?
So if the contract is entered between the parent and the state for the ESA, the contract between the school and the parent is separate. So when the parent decides how to spend that money, any strings that may apply to public funds are not going to follow into the private schools. So, because that contract is made between the parent and the school for the education of that student. Essentially, at that point, it's like using your own dollars to pay for the school. So now you could impose those through the bill. That is something the state could choose to do, but right now, the way it's structured, no. Now, there are still certain federal anti-discrimination requirements that apply to the schools, and nothing changes about that under this bill, but the private schools already have to apply those. This bill does not change any anti-discrimination laws or exempt schools or parents from any anti-discrimination laws that already exist, but it doesn't impose any new ones either.
Well, I guess I thought that private schools, especially private religious schools, were exempt from non-discrimination laws, and that bothers me. So why don't we just give every student in New Hampshire an ESA and decide if they want to give it to the public school or decide if they want to give it to the religious school? I mean, I guess that's far-fetched, but that seems fairer.
No, federal anti-discrimination laws, there are a number of federal anti-discrimination laws that apply equally to private schools and public schools. There are exemptions depending on the schools, so...
Am I up?
I guess so.
Thank you all for being here today. I was really hoping to hear both sides of school choice here today. I know this is an information forum, and information to me is information from everybody, from all sides, and then me determine whether or not it is information for me to walk away with. But I appreciate the knowledge that you have and the information you provided. I am 100% behind school choice, and the last comment was provide money to everybody, have them go out and do it is my cup of tea. I do have a question, however, for you. When you say that in New Hampshire, the advisory opinion given by the New Hampshire Supreme Court in 1969, and the language that you had up there about secular education serving a public purpose must have sufficient safeguards provided to prevent more than incidental and indirect benefit to religious sect or denomination. I believe you said that the safeguards the courts look for are the federal law. However, when I look at the actual opinion, the safeguards that the Supreme Court was looking at in the state of New Hampshire to determine whether or not legislation would be considered constitutional or not, they looked at the language of the bill and the language of the legislation to determine whether or not the safeguards were provided in there to prevent more than an incidental and indirect benefit to religious sect or denomination. And in fact, in paragraph 2, they said without restricting aid in the proposed legislation to a secular education would produce an unconstitutional discrimination. So I disagree with you that they look to the federal court for this specific safeguard. They look to the legislation. So my question to you is, if they look to the legislation, would it not be prudent for us to say that no funds will go to private religious education, not to the school, but just to the education, and do away with all this? Thank you.
I don't agree that that is necessary at all. And here's the reason. In 1969, the New Hampshire Supreme Court was looking to federal law to determine what the appropriate safeguards were. And they believed at the time that federal law required that any funds specifically be restricted in terms of private religious education. That's what they believed federal law to require in 1969. However, today, in 2017, we know that under federal law, the appropriate safeguards are private choice and religious neutrality. Those are the safeguards that the federal courts require. So that has become crystallized over a series of U.S. Supreme Court opinions from 1993 to 2002. So the reason why the New Hampshire court at that time was looking for those specific words in the legislation was they believed it was required by federal law, and it is simply not required by federal law. Yeah, and we can, but like I said, that is my interpretation. There is no doubt that this, if this bill passes, it will be challenged in court, regardless of whether you include that language or not. It will still be challenged in court. That language would not prevent the legal challenge from being filed. I think that's right.
My question is about something which I'm sure has arisen in other states, but probably especially significant in New Hampshire, where we have, I guess, at least 4 of the elite prep schools, and I guess they're part of the National Association of Independent Schools, which are already giving students scholarships for various reasons, entirely with non-governmental funds, some of which is through various foundations, some of which is through the program called A Better Choice, and that would be mostly students from out of state, although they could become eligible apparently by living in New Hampshire with the host family for a year and becoming a resident and then applying for this program. But also something, although it's a relatively small group of students, but we've been told this is a program that's not that many families can take advantage of, is there's elite athletes. One school here in New Hampshire has a elite basketball program that competes on a national program and brings students in. And it seems to me we might easily end up subsidizing that program with tax dollars, because the family could bring in a 8th grader and he could play basketball at middle school for a year and become a local family, be their legal guardian, and then we could apply for that program, and then they could go, I guess, not just any of those 4 schools, but even ones out of state. So what sort of safeguards are there, aside from the fact that I guess the scholarship organization could say that this is not a valid use of the scholarship program?
So I apologize. I'm not sure what the question is.
Yes. Basically, how do we prevent this from from being applied to students who would already be receiving scholarships from private schools for whatever reason, but especially for elite athletics who are now receiving the scholarships, which is a great thing, but now it's being paid for without taxpayers' dollars, and now we're going to be subsidizing this.
If they're already receiving a scholarship of some sort from a private school, I believe it indicates that they are not currently enrolled in a public school and therefore are not eligible for the program.
But going forward, what would stop these institutions from identifying promising students, sending them here to New Hampshire for a year to 2 to become residents of New Hampshire, and then go through this program, which I guess they could even go to an out-of-state school using this program?
If they otherwise meet the eligibility requirements of a 1 year in public school, the financial requirements in the bill, or in it being enrolled in a district that's failed them, they would be eligible for the program. Oh, yes, sir.
Thank you. I was wondering,
I apologize.
On the left side of the room, maybe that's wrong or something. But, if I could beg your indulgence, can we flip back a couple of slides to the Stabilization Grant concerning Littleton? That's the one. I'm a little confused. If a student leaves the school system and takes advantage of this educational scholarship, does the school district obviously will not be getting the Adequacy Grant for that student? Is the school district also going to lose the Stabilization Grant? I come from a city that has a very large stabilization grant in addition to the adequacy grant? And does the school district not get both of those items? Representative Cordelli.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. It might be a little confusing in that there's two different stabilization grants that are in play here. One is the adequacy stabilization grant that I think a year or so ago, in the last budget, we reduced stabilization by 4% each year, which was basically the stabilization or hold harmless provisions of the last adequacy formula. This bill has its own stabilization grant in it. Maybe we should have called it something else, but nonetheless, this stabilization grant applies if the adequacy dollars going to that school district are greater than 1/4% of their approved budget based on the number of students leaving and the adequacy dollars leaving. Then anything above that 1/4% would be granted to that school district for a period of years, even though that child has left the school, as sort of a ESA hold harmless provision.
Okay, that clears it up. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I have a couple of questions. The first one is, it was mentioned that if the unused money would go back to the treasurer, but why wouldn't it go back to the school district that lost it? That's one question.
This money comes from the state treasury into the education savings account, and if the child moves out of state or is non-compliant, would go back to the state treasury.
Okay, well, it was mentioned that it would be a contract between the parent and the state when they enter into this agreement. So what the Attorney General would enforce it, apparently, but being on the Fish and Game Committee and seeing that we passed a law a few years back to charge people that do stupid things, go out in McLean Mount, Washington in shorts in February or something, and get trapped. It happens. But they never collect any money because it's too hard to go after them. So would the Attorney General actually go after anybody, especially if they left the state?
There is a provision that cases of fraud must be reported to the Attorney General's office. Whether they view the evidence as sufficient to prosecute, that's their decision.
Okay, but I think it was mentioned that it had to be a certain amount for them to go after it when you were making the presentation. I was listening.
No, the way it's written in the bill itself is the way that Representative Cordelli just mentioned.
Okay. All right, and then there was only one other thing I had. It was there's going to be an ATM card of some sort that they can use for incidentals.
In most cases, there is a restricted use debit card that is used to hold the funds that are from the education savings account. And as Mr. Klein just mentioned to me, the payments into that account are made on a quarterly basis, so they don't get all the money up front.
So if I can just follow up, so it would work similar to a health savings account. So this is one model that ESAs use. So, if you have a health savings debit card, you can't just willy-nilly go buy groceries with it, right? And if you do, it's tracked because all the data is there. All your transactions are tracked. So there's accountability, and that's why some of these arguments we've heard in the last few days about, well, parents, my God, will just use this money to buy drugs or whatever. It doesn't work that way. It's only approved expenses, and if you have a debit card feature, every transaction is recorded, so there's accountability there.
Well, yeah, thank you. I understand that there's accountability, and they signed a contract, but getting it is another story. So I know when we were trying to do that with the cards for the welfare and stuff like that, they said, no, you can't do it because you can't stop it. So how are we going to stop this?
So the debit cards, if the debit card system is the one that is implemented, there are two different types of ways to restrict it. One is by merchant, so that they can only use the card at certain merchants. The other is actually by going down to the product level code. Every barcode has both a product, and you can actually, if they try to use the debit card on certain products, it would say nope, can't buy beer, you can't buy whatever it is. So you can restrict the cards down to those levels. The other option would be some states are actually going to like an online platform with an app, and you can only purchase the things that have been pre-approved that are on the app, and it's basically a direct transfer from the account to the end user, and those are all individuals who have been pre-approved by, in this case, the scholarship organization.
Thank you. And I know you mentioned a few times that the constitutionality and that these people that challenged it actually won in the past, right? It took time and the person had graduated and so forth. But now isn't that now the basis that anybody can sue us?
So, no. There's two different types of legal cases we've discussed this morning. One are cases in which individuals with disabilities who believe they are being inadequately served by the public schools have unilaterally placed their students in private schools and sued the districts for reimbursement. They can do that now anytime they want under federal law. That's something that could occur at any point. The other type of legal challenges we've talked about are claims that it is unconstitutional to allow families within a school choice program to attend religious schools, which is just a totally separate legal issue from the other type of cases we've been discussing this morning.
All right, thank you.
Representative Myler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question regarding religious neutrality and how that's defined, because religious schools are based on a set of core values. I mean, that's why they're there. Whether it's a Catholic school, a Christian school, they're formed around a set of values that drive the mission of the school district. So when you begin to talk about religious neutrality, I just don't understand that. If I go into Our Lady of Fatima School, for example, I walk right in and there's the Virgin Mary sitting right in front of me. And if you have a child who comes in who may not be of the faith, but their parents want them to come to that school, and he asks one of the sisters there, "What is this?" And she then starts talking about the Virgin Mary, the background of the school, why it's here. How do you draw a distinction then between what is religious neutrality vis-a-vis a curriculum that may say evolution is the way it should be, and none of the other scientific stuff is really relevant? So where does that, from a legal standpoint, how is that determined?
So the state is the entity that has to be neutral with regard to religion. And what the Supreme Court has said is that the state can neither favor nor disfavor religion over non-religion or one religion over another. In other words, the state has to just put blinders on when it drafts the law and not say anything with regard to a parent's choice of what school to attend. And it's that parental choice that breaks the link between church and state. So if a parent wants to enroll their student in a Catholic school or a Lutheran school or a non-religious Montessori school, the state doesn't have the state's role is not to say, no, you can't choose a religious education, or you can't choose a Catholic education.
So then if I may then on that, excuse me, but then if I may, then by granting state tax dollars to a parent, the parent then becomes, that tax dollar then becomes neutral as it relates to the parent's choice of how they want to use that money, correct?
Right.
It's still tax dollars, but I mean it becomes neutral once that grant is given to the parent.
Yes.
So the test then legally is, does the taxpayer's money that it goes into that grant and then gets transferred into religious school, is that then constitutional?
It is constitutional because it's the parent's choice.
That's what I mean.
Yeah,
It's still tax money, though.
It's still tax money, yes.
Thank you.
Question as far as the stabilization grants or payments under this bill if it was passed.
If I could just follow up, there are programs in place right now in New Hampshire where state dollars are going to religious schools. On a local level, under child benefit services, municipalities have voted to send local tax dollars to religious schools. I'm thinking of Hampton and Sacred Heart School as one, because they recognize that Sacred Heart is educating those X number of students from Hampton and saving the Hampton School District money. So they provide money under the child benefit provisions, which is current state statute. In addition, the Department of Health and Human Services has child care programs for children of certain ages and certain income levels. And some of those dollars are being used at religious daycare centers without any issue. So it's in practice right now in New Hampshire.
So those dollars are being used to benefit the student, not to benefit the school.
There's a distinction between providing benefits for an individual and providing benefits directly to an institution. I mean, we think of all the analogous programs that are out there. When you provide benefits for an individual through Medicaid, and you're paying for their health care, are you paying for the health care, or are you paying for a religious hospital? You're paying for the health care. And so if an individual chooses to use their Medicaid benefits at a Catholic hospital, we don't consider that aid to the hospital. We consider it aid to the individual, and we don't restrict that individual's decision as how and where to spend their benefits. It's the same in the school choice program.
Okay, stabilization question. If this bill were to pass and a school district is entitled to a stabilization grant or payment under this program, where does that money come from?
From what I understand right now, it comes out of the Education Trust Fund. Now, we never had to do that with the Education Tax Credit Scholarship. They've never got to that level of 0.25%. The same language exists in the Education Tax Credit as in this bill.
Okay, another question is, because this bill has an FN attached, I assume if it were to pass, it goes to finance?
Well, that would be up to the speaker, but I think your assumption is very accurate.
Thank you.
I also have a stabilization grant question. There are roughly, I would say, 32 to 36 communities in the state that were formerly known as donor towns. I happen to represent 3 of them. I'm wondering, should those community schools be normally qualify for a stabilization grant? Would they receive it since they're not receiving adequacy funds to begin with? And again, where might those funds come from?
I don't think there is anything in the language of the bill that would prevent them from getting a grant for that stabilization money.
Thank you. My colleague from Northampton might have the same question.
Slide this down.
I don't think it goes any lower.
We're about here. As I stand in a puddle of my own making, I have a question. Question being, I represent several communities in the Seacoast and also chair of Winnicott High School. Now, Winnicott is a cooperative we have 4 towns basically tuitioning in to Winnicott. Now, if we lose 1% of the students because of this bill, that would equate to almost $250,000 out of our budget because of the tuitioning. How can I justify and to vote for this? Is there a reasoning to this? For me, I've got to go back as the chairman of a school board tomorrow and meet with our superintendent after being here late in the afternoon on this bill. Can you help me out?
I don't have that spreadsheet in front of me right now, which would show your district. I think Drew Klein has that. But the benefit that I see through all this is the student.
I'm not talking about students. I'm not talking special ed.
No, I'm talking
I'm
about
in very rich communities that I represent that are looking to go to St. Thomas, Phillips Exeter, St. Paul's, wherever, and now you're giving an amount of money that might just throw someone over. We at Winnicott lose that tuition coming in. So that's my problem.
Well, if I could just address that. So we didn't have data for Winnicott in ours because the state didn't have that data, that particular district, on the website. So, so I can't speak to the percentage budget that Winnicott would keep, but one way to look at it would be to take, 1% of your numbers, of your enrollment, do that adequate education, so 95% of 3636, and then if you want to add,
we're going to be losing $250,000.
What percentage of that is what percentage is that of your operating budget? So I guess that's the way to look at it. So there are a couple of ways you can look at this, right? If you're thinking of the district level, you got to think of.
I think everyone has to think of their district level.
Right. Am I as a district, right? Are you as a district serving the needs of every child in your district? If you believe that you are, then you shouldn't be worried about people leaving.
Well,
if you think people
are in an affluent area, there are people that are looking to go to private school, whether they come to Winnicott or not. Winnicott won the ESPY awards, top high school in the state, and then you're going to have these kids that are going to we've got wealthy people living in this area that are going to be going to Phillips, St. Thomas, all these prep schools, St. John's Preps or whatever, that they're going to do it anyway. Now we're going to lose that money. We lose it anyway, but yeah.
Well, so there's a certain, so there are restrictions in the bill as to who qualifies.
No, I'm just asking you to help me.
Well, that's what I'm not really here to help you. I'm just sort of here to explain the bill as we see it. But
I want you to help me.
But in my understanding, so if I'm looking at this from your point of view, so there are a certain number of restrictions in the bill for qualifications. One of them is below 300% of poverty. You've got special needs. You've got a district that might have 2 consecutive years of not showing adequate performance. You have all those factors in there. So it would be a much smaller percentage of Winnicott's population that would be eligible than, say, pick any other district that might have.
That's what I need to know is the eligibility.
I would.
You haven't expanded on this.
So I haven't looked at your district specifically to see what your eligibility would be, but my guess is it would be a much smaller eligibility
than a lot of other
districts, right? But number 2 is, you have a lot of wealthy people in your district. They're probably already, for whatever reason, if they really want to have a kid in the prep school, they've got their kid in the prep school.
They're going to go anyway, but this is just, and I've heard this from the community, is that if we can pick up a little extra money, it's free money. Why not take it? So, again, but I'm sure Representative Hill will.
Well, so your family, you got to think of your family's motivation, right? So what's my motivation for applying for an ESA, right? My motivation for applying for an ESA is that I think I can get a better education for my kid somewhere other than my local regional school or resident school. So, what percentage of your families think that they're going to get a better education, of your eligible families?
Winnicott has
pretty small percentage.
Students, a total student population of 1,360 students. Of that, you have 369 that qualify for special. No, excuse me, I'm in the wrong line here. I got to get closer to where I can read it. You have 1,044 students. You have 155 special service students, and 84 free and reduced. And what we're seeing in other states, of those that are eligible, we see 1%. I would say the number of students which would leave your district would be almost minuscule.
I don't see it, but I just bring this up as a situation.
And just so,
everybody is concerned.
Yeah.
But just to keep this in context too, so I'm looking, we do have Winnicott average daily membership changes. We've looked back from 2010 to 2015. And so the Winnicott Cooperative School District fluctuation in ADM year to year, we've got 1.2%, 1.2, 3.7, 2.9, 1.8, 2.2. So if you're talking about 1%, we would reasonably estimate that Winnicott would be a district that would not even get to 1%, right? Your average fluctuation year to year is over 1%. So the impact is going to be, I would expect, pretty darn small and much less than what the district is accustomed to dealing with on a year-to-year basis.
Just a quickie. I have to meet with my God. My pastor's on my back. I wanted to know why, if this is all so constitutional and it's all right and all the money's there, and one, are there caps? Does every student who's going to apply and who is eligible going to get the money? And two, why did we contract a company to do this as a third party and do separate contracts? Because it sounds to me like it's an end run around, and that's just the way I think, that it's an end run around what the Constitution says, because the money doesn't go directly to the schools, or it goes to the parent through a third party. And three, is all of this administration part of the 5%, the DBT cards and all of that? And that's...
Yeah, I can answer a couple of those questions. So, and then I can let Tim probably answer others. So, for a couple of reasons, this is a parental choice program. It's a parental empowerment program. That's why the money doesn't go directly to the school, right? So it's not a voucher. The money doesn't go from the state to the school. By creating an ESA and letting the parent have more say, you can see in this bill, it gives you a list of qualifying expenses. That's much more empowering for a family than saying, well, we're going to send it directly to a list of schools here, right? So the parent can pick a tutor. The parent could pick classes at a community college, right? Online classes. It gives parents a lot more options for satisfying the needs of the kid. That's why you do it as an ESA, right? No. So the ESA, and so that, let me address that part, right? The education savings account has to be, so if you want the accountability for the expenses and the pass-throughs, the financial accountability, you want to create an administrator for that program. The way this bill works, that administrator gets to keep 5% of the cost. That is really low. So there's some misunderstandings about how much administrative costs are. We looked at what New Hampshire public schools spend for administration, and I have those numbers here. So let me look here. So this is by State Department of Education data. Administrative expenses at the public school level averaged 5.5%. So that's already higher than the 5% this organization gets. administrative expenses at the district level is an additional 4.2%. So in the public schools system, your administrative expenses are already 9.7%, whereas the ESA program, your administrative expenses are only 5%. So you're actually spending less on administration by going through the ESA program. It's not going to enrich anybody. It's actually cutting administrative costs. But you need that. I don't know if you need it, but this bill says, you have the ESA organization there as a mechanism for providing the accountability that the state wants.
And the decision to use a third-party contractor as opposed to a state agency has nothing to do with the constitutional issues. This program would be every bit as constitutional if it was the state treasurer that was administering the program, like is the case under Nevada's program, or if it was the State Department of Education, which is the case under the Arizona program. It's just that of all the ESAs that currently exist, the one that is most robust, that is most successful is Florida's ESA program, and Florida's ESA program is operated by a third-party contractor who is dedicated to getting word out about the program, who's dedicated to serving the families, and so I think it's a policy decision. How does the state of New Hampshire want to run the program? It has nothing to do with the constitutional issues. It's purely a matter of policy.
I'd like to ask there's two people remaining that have questions. I'd like to, if you would please, would you ask us separately, there is a lunch being served downstairs right now, and we're holding up people right here who may want to leave for a lunch. We've gone a half hour over where we intended to go. So if you'd like to come down and ask your questions, we'd be pleased to remain here and answer them if we can. You're welcome.